I just thought in relation to a couple of these things, it's perhaps a pity that Mr Nash was not actually on the committee, and perhaps some of these questions might have been actually appropriately answered by his colleagues. But for the information of listeners, it is worth knowing that the register itself will actually be an online document, as you would expect, given that the bill itself says it will be in an electronic form. So I'd have to say some of the issues that are being raised by the previous speaker are rather tenditious, and people will make their own interpretations to the amount of time being spent on the House on this matter.
No, the member's exhausted his calls. Claire Curran.
Mr Chair.
Point of order, Stuart Nash.
Mr Chair, my point of order is that the Minister said that the register must be kept online. The bill actually says the register may be kept online.
That's a debating point. That's a debating point. And order. It's a debating point, and you've exhausted your calls. Maybe your colleague would like to pick it up. Claire Curran.
Mr Chair, with reference to Part 2 of the bill, again, I'd first of all like to put on the record my appreciation of the Minister's comments with regards to financial literacy and the work that's being done by the government in that area, and I note that it's at its early stages, and I'm pleased to hear that it is happening and that it is being seen as important and some sort of priority, and also to note that those of us on this side of the House will be keeping an eye on this issue because we see it as being extremely important. So with regards to Part 2 and with regards to the licensing and registration accreditation issues, I'd like to just go back to the harmonisation issue and think about why we're doing this reform in the first place, which is that regulation of auditors, because as we know, it's hugely important to the investors and the regulators and other financial market participants, and it's now been acknowledged that the people doing the investing who in this increasingly complex world with increasingly complex legislation require more and more assistance around financial literacy. This legislation is there because in New Zealand there have been strong indications that the auditors of some of the finance companies lacked the necessary competence to carry out those audits or didn't have a sufficient degree of independence. And I think what it demonstrated is that New Zealand's self-regulatory model isn't any longer within the range of the acceptable auditor regulation system, and New Zealand needs to change in order to obtain the right to practice in Australia and other jurisdictions such as the European Union, which is where that harmonisation issue comes in. And I know that the Minister responsible for this bill, the Honourable Simon Power, does have that in mind and that has talked a lot about this, but what we haven't seen with this piece of legislation is that ability to move towards that harmonisation yet. And we considered carefully whether that bill should be expanded to introduce measures to limit auditors' liability. So this is going to the limitations on liability issue, and recognise that some form of liability limitations would harmonise New Zealand's system with international practice. However, we concluded we couldn't go down that path because the scope of the bill wouldn't allow us to, but we did signal that we'd like to see the issue addressed in the broader review of securities law, which in regard to amending the Securities Act 1978 and the Companies Act 1993 to remove the prohibitions on issuer and company audits being carried out by bodies corporate and replacing auditors' current exposure to joint and several liability with alternative systems such as proportionate or capped liability. And there certainly was, Mr Chair, a lot of discussion in the Select Committee around this issue because, and we, as I think I said in my previous speech, that we asked the officials for really comprehensive advice and they provided it, and I'd certainly just like to acknowledge that comprehensive advice because that comprehensive advice is hopefully going to provide the underpinning to whatever happens next around this limited liability issue. And there were 4 alternative approaches that have been adopted elsewhere, and I'll just touch briefly on them. The first one was incorporation, because in many jurisdictions, companies and limited liability partnerships are able to carry out audits, and those limited liability partnerships are an alternative corporate business vehicle that give the benefits of limited liability but allow their members the flexibility to organise their internal structures as a traditional partnership. The second approach was proportionate liability, which was where the court determines liability among the negligent parties according to their share of the blame, which allowed the courts to have regard to the comparative responsibility of any wrongdoer who isn't a party to the proceedings. The third approach was liability caps, giving the amount of liability to be capped at a multiple of the fee and or a fixed dollar amount in relation to any one course of action. And the fourth was contractual restrictions on liability, and under that approach the auditor or the preparer may contractually agree to a restriction in liability. So we looked at a number of jurisdictions, and those jurisdictions included Australia, the United Kingdom, Singapore, Hong Kong, where high liability, auditor liability reform had been considered and still was being considered internationally. Some of those jurisdictions have, such as Australia, have already settled on their policies and laws, and we could well do looking more closely at them. And I do hope that with, in terms of a broader review of the securities law, that we actually will go down that path and will look at that. And given the fact that Australia is moving ahead on this issue, and that's one of the areas, parts of the world where harmonisation is so important, we could well do better than looking at what's happening over there. Other jurisdictions, such as the United Kingdom, have implemented some reforms, and they're now evaluating, I think, their performance, and others such as Singapore and Hong Kong. Well, they're at a stage where they're considering and identifying the issues with their current regimes and are still at the beginning of the process to consider possible reforms. So, as I said at the beginning, that while we considered that amendment around the limitations on liability would be outside of the scope of this bill, we asked to see that this issue was addressed in the broader review of securities law, if the Minister is able to give a comment on that, that would be quite useful, about how and when that is going to be addressed. The Select Committee believes that consideration should be being given to amending the Securities Act and replacing the auditor's current exposure to joint and several liability with alternative systems such as proportionate liability or capped liability. So very much would like to see that addressed. Interested to see what a response is from the Minister, if possible.
Yes.
And look forward to hearing that.
The question is that the Minister's amendments set out on SOP number 239 be agreed to. As many of that opinion, please say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The question now is that Part 2 as amended stand part. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. The question now is that Part 3, debate on clauses 72 through to 82 and Schedule 1 stand part.
Mr. Chair.
I call the Honourable Minister Georgina Te Heoheo. Tēnā